Hi, Austin. Hi, Kellyanne. I hope you guys are refreshed and ready to start the fall semester. It should be a great year. Senior year is so much fun. There will be so many fun and exciting memories for you to make this year. I want to make this online class as easy for you as I can. So before each major section, I will give video notes to you. I will be checking in with you in person and through email pretty frequently to be sure that you guys are okay, to be sure that you're understanding the material and that you are understanding your assignments and getting them finished on time. If at any point you need to see me, please come by my office, email me, send me a text, anything that you need to do to get in touch with me, and I will be here to help you. British literature is my passion, and so I am thrilled to be able to offer this class to you. And I hope that you will find a lot of beneficial material within it, okay? To get started, we are going to be reading Beowulf. Beowulf is the beginning of British literature. It really is the foundations of it. And so before we can really read Beowulf and understand what the poet is doing within it, we have to understand the culture and the people from which it comes. Who were they? What did they believe? How did they live? What did they eat? I mean, we really need to explore who they were and the depths of their humanity to understand what the poet is trying to do in Beowulf. So here are some notes on the Anglo-Saxon people and a little bit of background information on Beowulf. You see that first sentence there. If it looks like an alien language to you, it is. This is actually Old English. What it says doesn't look anything like what is printed on your screen there. Read in Old English, that phrase is Lof deodum sheol in megtha gewer man getion. Translated in modern English, that means behavior that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. I mean, how could you not get that from the Old English, right? Underneath that, you see the tagline, The Anglo-Saxons, Beowulf and Blood Feud, a study of the Dark Ages. We can't really call the period in which Beowulf is set the Dark Ages anymore. We called this time period the Dark Ages long ago, before we knew much about the people and the culture. What we know about the people comes from the literature and from excavations. And in the last couple hundred years, through accidental discoveries, we have found massive burial sites for the Anglo-Saxon people, village sites for the people, where a plethora of relics have been unearthed that show us who the people really were. We have insight now into their day-to-day lives, their work, their diets, their religious beliefs, basically everything. And so we can't really call that time period the Dark Ages anymore because we know entirely too much about them to do that anymore. So who were the Anglo-Saxons? The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes were independent Germanic tribes or invaders who come from Northern Europe, and they start arriving on what we call British soil from the 5th to the 6th centuries. And they arrive because what they find is that the Roman forces who had been there before have departed, and the land is ripe for the taking. In 55 BC, we see what we consider to be Britain fall under Roman control, and that lasts until roughly 410. And in the year 410, what we find is that there's so much political unrest happening in Rome that these descendants of the original Roman soldiers who arrived in Britain feel it's their duty to go home and help take care of the political unrest and the wars going on there in Rome. And so the British soil is left unprotected. Angles, Saxons, and Jutes begin arriving in droves. They are going to settle specific realms or kingdoms and take them for their own. They're going to rule from 410 until 1066. So this is a pretty massive empire. If you look at the map, you're going to notice that there are 7 individual realms. So we have a heptarchy originally. You have Northumbria, Mercia there in the middle, Wessex, Sussex, Kent, Essex, and East Anglia. And these individual territories are going to fight and feud to expand their power until King Ethelstan of Kent finds a way to unite all of the different kingdoms and basically create one united England. So when we look at the whole span of the British monarchy, King Ethelstan really is the first English king. Ethelstan uses a lot of different tactics to join the 7 different realms into one united kingdom. One is through force. If you look at that little sliver, that little blue sliver of land labeled as Kent on the map, it doesn't look very powerful. It's smaller than the other areas. You're going to see that it's got more opportunity for invaders to arrive on its shores. You would think that Mercia would be a better place for a seat of government, or Northumbria, because it would be further away from outside attack. But no, Kent actually is the powerhouse. Ethelstan was a great military leader, but he also does something pretty awesome, which is that he is going to be very quick to adopt Christianity, and the other kingdoms follow suit. And so you're going to see part of the reason the kingdoms are united is because of that. The Anglo-Saxons ruled Britain until 1066, when you are going to see Norman invaders arrive, led by William of Normandy. You know him better as William the Conqueror. And at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, Harold II, who was the Anglo-Saxon king, is defeated by William of Normandy. And so the Anglo-Saxon time period ends with that particular battle in 1066. Socially and culturally, the Anglo-Saxons weren't different from many ancient peoples. They were a hierarchy with the king at the top. Underneath the king, the next rung of the social ladder would be your ealdormen. These would be the king's advisors, people the king trusted to maybe go into different areas of the kingdom and be kind of like mayors in a way. They would report back to the king. They could make some legal decisions without the king's permission, but ultimately, they, like everyone else, was responsible to the king. Underneath that, you have a group of men called thanes or lords. These are going to be large landowners. Politically, they don't have a lot of power. Monetarily, they do. Okay. Underneath that, you have the ceorls, or the churls, if you look at the modern English. Your churls are going to be your craftsmen. These are your blacksmiths, your farmers, your fishermen. These are going to be people who make stuff, in other words. The majority of your population in Anglo-Saxon England are going to be churls. Underneath that, you have slaves. These were often people called, or thralls. These were often people who were in trouble with the law, and so they would give their lives over to being slaves in lieu of a death penalty. These were people who, for whatever reason, just didn't fall into any of these other categories. And so you're going to see a smaller population of slaves than the other categories in Anglo-Saxon England. What was the Anglo-Saxon law like? Much of it was unwritten. You see one particular law above the others called the blood feud, and this is a system of retributive justice. This was an eye for an eye kind of government at first. Very much you see echoes back to Levitical and Mosaic law with this concept of the blood feud. And so what happens is, in a blood feud, families are responsible for exacting vengeance for themselves. Family units were important in the Anglo-Saxon culture. These individual family units were called clans. And so these clans lived together kind of communally and looked after each other. So what blood feud would be this. If a member of clan A murdered a member of clan B, then clan B not only has the legal right to go over and kill someone in Clan A, but they are expected to. And in theory, the idea was that the blood feud would cut back ultimately on the amount of bloodshed and violence. But that doesn't happen. It becomes cyclical. It becomes perpetuated to the point that many families didn't know why or when the feud even began. You can think about our famous American blood feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. No one knows exactly what ignited that feud, but it went on for centuries. Eventually, you do get tired of the constant fighting, the constant bloodshed. And so the Anglo-Saxons are going to instill a concept called the weregild. And that translated into modern English means the man price. And so instead of seeking vengeance for a slain relative, clansmen would decide how much that man's life had been worth and then kind of charge it to the other side. So the weregild could be paid back in livestock, gold, food, other goods, weapons, anything that would basically wipe out the cost for a fallen kinsman's life. Anglo-Saxon law was primarily corporal punishment and capital punishment. There were no jails. If you violated Anglo-Saxon law, you were physically beaten to make up for it, or you were put to death. Capital punishment was very popular. Anglo-Saxon law focused more on the criminal behavior, not civil suits, because clans basically fought it out among themselves. The economics of the Anglo-Saxon culture were focused more on trade, especially the trade of goods from the churls and labor. There was no formal cash system. There was no formal bank system. Interesting that for hundreds and hundreds of years, this method of economics worked. Religion. Early Anglo-Saxon society was pagan. You have these Germanic peoples coming in with their own histories, with their own beliefs. And so what you have is a pagan culture until the late 500s. And you see Pope Gregory the Great send a monk, Augustine, to Kent in the hopes of converting the Anglo-Saxon people to Christianity. It happens very easily. Within about a decade, all of Anglo-Saxon England is Christian. A decade is not long in the scope of history. It's a little sliver of time. And so why was this conversion so easy? Augustine was smart. He went in with a game plan. He arrived on Anglo-Saxon soil knowing that they are a violent people, knowing that they are not going to accept a God of peace and tranquility so easily. And so he presents Christ as being a warrior, which of course the Anglo-Saxon people were quite familiar with. And so he makes Jesus as this warrior who does battle against evil. And so you see there is a direct correlation between a warrior's mentality and Christ there. He also tells them that if they pray to their one God, then that one God will ensure their safety in battle. And I think probably part of the reason the conversion was so easily is that you do have a culture who they're tired of fighting. They're tired of bloodshed. And so this God of peace appeals to them. One of the most beautiful works to come from the Anglo-Saxon period is a poem called The Dream of the Rood. A rood is a cross. That's the Old English word for cross. And there's a picture of it if you look there on your screen. And in The Dream of the Rood, you have the crucifixion story told from the point of view of the cross itself. From when it was a tree hewn down to being toted to Calvary, to being erected, to Christ then placing himself upon it as a warrior. And it really is quite a lovely poem. It's not a very long poem. If you have time, I would definitely read that. So the Anglo-Saxons, as I've said before, were a warrior culture. Every part of their being is permeated with this idea. There's a great pride in battle and war. The accomplishments on the battlefield are what defined a man. When Beowulf arrives in King Hrothgar's kingdom, after he introduces himself, he goes into this litany of his accomplishments in battle, of the monsters he's fought, of the victories he's won. He does this to establish himself because they define him as a man. Beowulf is nothing without them. We will see a character named Unferth do the same. He and Beowulf kind of get into this contest about which is the best warrior, and they both go back and forth listing their bravado and their victories and such. Weapons were artwork. Weapons were personified. They were given names. They were taken into battle as these, almost religious items. If you look there on the screen at your pictures, you're going to see all of the intricate gold. You're going to see gemstones sometimes on Anglo-Saxon weapons, sometimes words or phrases or biblical scripture after the conversion would have been inscribed on the blades. You see the gold on the hilt of that sword. You see gold overlay on the shield there. And then you see the gilt down at the bottom and all of the beautiful inscriptions and carvings on the hilt of those swords. So weapons were artwork, and they were made by very skilled artisans. They were given names, much like modern musicians will name a guitar. You see the Anglo-Saxons referring to their weapons by proper names. Beowulf has two throughout the course of the poem. One of them is runting. The other is nagling. We know a lot about the warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons from archaeological evidence and burial mounds that have been found. In one particular excavation, and we call it the Sutton Hoo excavation because of where it was located, you have an Anglo-Saxon leader who's been buried with his ship, an entire ship. And on board it are the remains of this one particular Anglo-Saxon warrior, and all around him were gold, jewels, weapons, chainmail. So we know a lot about them and the warrior culture that they belong to because of what we find at digs. We know they're a warrior culture based on their laws. One look at the blood feud shows the violence, particularly that physical man-on-man violence that we see. Unfortunately, a side effect of such a stringent warrior culture would be the neglect of women and children. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on. The entertainment of the Anglo-Saxon people was not much. Warriors would often meet together and congregate at beer halls. These would be places that kings would build, generals would build for their men, places where they could go and drink and relive their days of glory, places they could spend the night. These were also places that traveling minstrels or shops, that word is not scop, it's shop, where they would actually travel around and they would sing, they would dance, they would tell stories, put on plays of sorts. Beowulf, for example, would have originally been told by one of these shops or minstrels. Beowulf, at first, of course, like most literature, was told orally by word of mouth and not written down for several hundred years. So what we have of Beowulf may be a fragment of what we used to have. The culture itself was surprisingly literate. I'm not sure why we're so surprised by this. Perhaps it's being closed-minded, but we have a number of books and written records left from the Anglo-Saxon period to know that they were actually a quite literate people. Other forms of entertainment involve training for war. You're a warrior culture, that's what you enjoy, and so you are going to be trained. Jousts, maybe. Sword fights, certainly. Defensive moves, certainly would have been done. So Anglo-Saxon entertainment, of course, isn't a whole lot. If you look at the beautiful pictures here, you're going to see examples of that Anglo-Saxon craftsmanship. Jewels primarily were garnets, lapis, which is a blue stone. Garnets are that kind of brownish red stone. You're going to see emeralds a lot inlaid into artifacts from the Anglo-Saxon period. Lots of gold, lots and lots of gold. Anglo-Saxon gold is very, very expensive. It's not as rare as you would think. Interesting note, Princess Kate, when she and Prince William got married, the Queen of England gave her an Anglo-Saxon gold wedding band. So the gold on her hand is from probably any time between the year 400 to the year 1000, which I think is pretty cool. In the lower right-hand corner, that is a little effigy of King Ethelstein of Kent. And then you see some charms, some pendants, rings, and things of that nature there. A belt buckle, for example. So Beowulf, what exactly is it? If you look at the title, Beo means son, and wolf, of course, means wolf, surprisingly. So the name means son of wolf. It is an epic poem. You can probably think back to 9th grade when you read the Odyssey by Homer. An epic is a long work in which a hero of some sort emerges, and he goes through various trials and tribulations, a lot of different internal conflicts before he can truly be called a hero. If you look at the Odyssey, Odysseus, in his quest to get back to his kingdom after being off at war for, all these years, he has to go through all of these different challenges. You have the sea monsters of Scylla and Charybdis. You have the sirens who try to lure his men into a wreck. He gets stranded on the island with Circe and Calypso. And it takes him 20 years to get home. And throughout the course of the whole epic, he has to be tested and found worthy of being called a hero by the poem's end. And so Beowulf is not much different. Beowulf at the beginning is a prince. He does not pride himself on being a prince, of course. He's a warrior above all else. And he goes from being a warrior to eventually, at the end of his life, being a king. But the poem's about his journey and what he learns and where his triumphs and failures are. And there's a question of, by the end, is he really an epic hero or not? Beowulf is considered to be the first work of British literature, the first major work of British literature. And so it has importance, of course, because of that. While it is your first work of British literature, it is not set in England. It is set in Scandinavia. Hetland is a made-up place. Beowulf is going to be called the king of the Geats by the end of the poem. It's also set in part in Denmark, which is where King Hrothgar's kingdom is located. Beowulf was written down finally somewhere around the year 1000, but it was older than that. And looking at certain historical names and phrases that are mentioned within the original text of Beowulf, we do know that it's possibly as old as the 8th century. The only existing first original draft of Beowulf is in a book called the Exeter Book, which unfortunately over time suffered a whole lot of damage. The Exeter Book is located now in the British Library, and you can see what is left of Beowulf. A fire took out a huge section of the original text. So when you think Beowulf looks like a long poem, keep in mind we lost a lot of it. We don't know how much, but we've lost a lot of it. You see parallels in Beowulf to Norse mythology. So you see that kind of pagan idea present within the text. There's a story in the middle called the Sigmund episode, and Sigmund is a Norse figure who battles a dragon. And Sigmund is paralleled to Beowulf. You see a direct connection between these two heroes. A lot of the reason we focus on Beowulf, a lot of the credit can be given to J.R.R. Tolkien, and I know you know that name. Tolkien wrote, of course, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. And Tolkien was a medievalist. He always said he was a medievalist above everything else, even above being a writer. Tolkien really loved the story of Beowulf. And in 1934, he puts together a collection of essays that he had written over time and published a book called The Monsters and the Critics. And in it, he is very clear about the importance of the Anglo-Saxon people. And he writes about the monsters in Beowulf and Beowulf himself. And he looks at the warrior culture under a microscope. And his work really propelled Beowulf back to the forefront of the British canon. So those are the notes that I'm going to give you. I'm not going to give you a lot of background information about the individual characters because you meet them pretty early on in the story, and because they all like to brag, you'll know far more about them from the words in the text than I could, of course, tell you. Beowulf is not as thick of a book or poem as you might think, so don't let it be intimidating to you. What you'll notice when you read is that on the left-hand page, you have the original text. You have the Old English. On the right-hand side, you have the modern translation. So it's not quite as bad as it looks. It's literally going to be half of what you see here. On the cover, you have original chainmail. This would have been basically covering a warrior's entire body to keep arrows and to keep blades from penetrating. And you'll see Beowulf dressed out in chainmail multiple times throughout the course of the story. I mentioned earlier the neglect of women and children in the Anglo-Saxon culture. That was the focus of my master's thesis. And so I've actually translated large sections of Beowulf myself. So if you have any questions as you read, please definitely ask me. I'll be happy to help you with that. So Beowulf is kind of like reading a fantasy of sorts. There's a lot of supernatural in it. There's a lot of sci-fi to it. It has a very science fiction mood at certain times. There's a dragon, for example. Beowulf's physical strength, it's superhuman. It couldn't happen. But then you have very human elements as well, in that you see grief and you see rage and you see jealousy and all of these different things that really push man. And so it's this great kind of work. It's like reality and sci-fi married really well together, which I think is pretty interesting, that your first major work of British literature is science fiction. That's kind of cool, I think. I think that says a lot about mankind and what we like and what we don't, right? So I hope you enjoy it. If you have any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them for you. You should read the first section in your syllabus, the first reading assignment, between August 12th and August 16th. You are going to have some discussion boards to do. With the discussion boards, please take them seriously. Don't wait until the night before they're due to post. Don't wait until 5 minutes before the board closes to post. You should be reading and keeping up with the course on a pretty regular schedule. And when you make comments, when you put your own ideas and analysis out there, be specific. Don't be generic. That'll make me think you didn't read, right? We don't want that. Give your peers meaningful feedback. I will be commenting a lot because I'm really excited about this class. You may not be able to tell it, but I'm really excited about this class. So I'll be making comments and asking questions and prodding the conversation along throughout the week as well. I will give you a rubric of the discussion board's requirements very soon. I'll give you a physical copy, but it will also be in Canvas if you need a copy of it. I can't think of anything else right now, but if you have questions, just let me know. Excited to have you guys in class. See you Monday.